That was just a week's preparation. I'd love to see what you could do with actual time to get ready. Thank you very much for that. So, as we've already talked about in this worship service, this is the beginning of school. And so, one of the most common activities that will be happening in the next few weeks at school, at least for the younger kids in our schools, will be that time-honored opportunity to give every child a chance to tell a story, maybe about something they experienced over the summer, in that activity we know as show and tell. Do you remember doing show and tell when you were a kid in school? What's the best thing that you ever took to show and tell? Stop and think about that for just a moment. While you're thinking about that, let me share the results of some research I did about that very question. There was a 9-year-old boy in Nebraska who probably had one of the most memorable show and tells in history when, without telling his teacher or his parents, he decided to bring his horse to school. What made it even more memorable was when his horse did what horses do right there in school. There was a 7-year-old girl in Cleveland who brought her pet mouse to school, only for the teacher to discover it was a little too large to be a mouse. It was a pet rat instead. And then from this morning, I heard a word from a man in our church who took a praying mantis to school when he was in 3rd grade, only to discover when he left it there over the weekend that it had been pregnant. And they came back to discover that the entire class was filled with praying mantises. Made him very popular. And then there is the story of the little 6-year-old boy in Des Moines who brought this box of leaves to school to be passed around. And only after it was a quarter away of around the room did he announce, as you pass this box of leaves around, I'll explain how I learned I am immune to poison ivy. Wouldn't you be excited to be the teacher of that class? What about you? What's the best thing that you ever experienced in show and tell? But have you ever wondered why that we call it both show and tell? This is a stone I took from the pool at the foot of Indian Creek Falls, this beautiful waterfall in Great Smoky Mountain National Park this summer. One Sunday, Allison and I were out for a little bit of time away. As you were worshiping here, Allison and I were worshiping in the beauty of God's creation. And I tell you that because if I just walked out with this rock and went like this, and then didn't say anything about it, what would you think about me? I'm a few French fries short of a Happy Meal. That's what you'd be thinking about me, that I've lost a screw or two. There's a reason why we don't just show, we don't just tell, we do both things. And that's not just true in elementary school. It's also the right way to do things for the church, too. A few years ago, the Barna Research Group was commissioned to do a groundbreaking study on shifting attitudes towards Christianity in the United States. What they discovered is a huge shift in generational perceptions of Christianity and the church. 23% of people aged 70 and older are non-Christians in the United States. 27% of people aged 50 to 70 are non-Christians in the United States. Now that's a little bit larger percentage as the population gets younger, but not hugely so. But below the age of 50, that number jumps to 37%. And below the age of 35, that number is now more than 40%. And that is huge. These statistics ought to take our breath away. The huge shift that has taken place in the span of just 2 generations. And we see that shift shaping everything around us. With the growing decline of religious values in our country, especially among the young, what we see and experience in our culture is being shaped by a different set of values than many of us are accustomed to. Certainly different than the ones that we adhere to here in this place. And that makes some people nervous or angry. That is why you can turn on your television or turn your radio dial to certain stations and hear so many people yelling at the top of their lungs that we have become disconnected from traditional values, that we have lost our moral compass, that we have abandoned the values that make this country great. Now, while some might debate that last point, it is absolutely fair to say that in very significant ways, our culture has changed. God, faith, church are no longer in the center as they once were. It's not a question we even have to ask anymore. The data is there to back it up. But even if we didn't have that data, I'm not sure that would be a particularly interesting question to ask anyway. The question that we ought to be asking isn't whether or not the culture has changed or whether or not the church is at the center of things. The question we ought to be asking, the interesting question, the thoughtful question, the faithful question is this: what do we do about it? What should the church's response be? What should our church's response be to the fact that it's no longer at the center, but instead is now moving towards the edge of our culture? In Judea in the first century, everybody was hungry for hope. The children of God had been promised that a better day was coming, that someday soon a man was going to appear and make everything like it was supposed to be. Everybody wanted him to come soon. Everyone. Including one of the most respected religious leaders of the day. I was looking for a parallel to help us understand just how important John the Baptist was. Honestly, the only person that comes close in recent memory is Billy Graham. Thousands and thousands of people would come to hear John the Baptist preach. He was so respected that he had his own disciples. And of course, you and I know the backstory of his relationship to Jesus. They were cousins. They both had this miraculous aspect to their birth. We don't know exactly what they were told about one another, but certainly their mothers had to have told them something. And yet, for decades, Jesus had just been quietly living his life. If John thought that his entire life and ministry was to prepare for the one that was to come, and if he had even an inkling that that might be Jesus, then don't you think he had to be wondering when it was all going to get started? Life expectancy in that day and time was less than 50 years, and Jesus hadn't done a thing until the time he turned 30. But then it began. Jesus started to preach in the towns and villages of Judea. Word began to spread about what he was saying, and not just what he was saying, but what he was doing. Because Jesus didn't just preach the gospel. He brought it into being by healing people, by casting out demons, in the text that was immediately before the one that Elijah read for us, he brought somebody back to life. As the word began to spread, John decides to ask a very important question. He doesn't set aside his ministry to do it. He sends some disciples to go and ask, "Are you the one? Are you him? Are you the one that we've all been waiting for?" Here's the funny thing when you think about it. John the Baptist is as religious as it gets his whole life. Everything about it, the way he ate, the way he dressed, the way he spoke, the way he spent his time, the way he invested his life, everything about him was shaped by his religious beliefs. But the question that he asked Jesus isn't really all that different from the question that people today are asking, including the roughly 31% of people in our country who don't consider themselves Christian. Is this it? Is this it? Is this what truly matters? Everybody's asking that question. They may not be framing it in terms of Jesus being the answer, but everyone's asking the question, how am I going to invest my life? How am I going to organize my time? What matters? What is meaningful? What will bring me joy and purpose? Is this it? John wanted to know if he needed to shape his life and ministry, not just around religious ideas, but around the person of Jesus. Are you him? Is this it? And we live in a world today where people are just as hungry as they were in the first century, even if many of them lack the religious background that John and the Jewish people had. But in the end, every time somebody looks for meaning and purpose, every time someone tries to figure out what matters enough to shape their lives, they're asking that question, is this it? And did you catch how Jesus responds to the question? I mean, there's 100 different ways he could have answered it. John, listen to your mama. You know, she told you a long time ago what your life is supposed to be about. John, obey the word. My coming has been predicted for a long, long time. But what does Jesus say to answer the question? Go back and report to John what you have seen, what you have heard. The blind receive sight. The lame walk. Those who have leprosy are cured. The deaf hear. The dead are raised. And the good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me. That's Jesus' way of saying, if you want to experience joy and meaning and purpose in life, this is it. I am it. And this is what it looks like. Jesus had been preaching in town after town, telling the people about God's plan for their lives and for the world. He'd been telling them what they needed to hear, but he hadn't just been telling them. He was showing them, too. Showing them that God didn't just care about their beliefs, but about their lives, too. The blind see, the lame walk, the poor receive good news. Jesus was a show and tell. Now, I don't know about you, but I grew up in churches that were a little bit better at telling than showing. That's actually been true of Baptist churches, Protestant churches, for a long, long time. You want proof? Well, one little piece of evidence is this. When you call somebody to lead any church that you've ever been a member of, in addition to their leadership skills, what's the one thing you want that person to be able to do as well as possible? To preach. I mean, you could be looking for a lot of different characteristics that you could put together with good leadership skills, and yet, for us in a church like this, preaching matters enough that we say this is something that we have to emphasize. Worship, for most of church history, focused, the central aspect of worship up until about 1500 was communion. And in Catholic churches today, that is still true. But in Protestant churches, in Baptist churches like ours, we organize the entire worship service toward what? The reading and hearing and preaching of God's Word. The churches that I grew up in, what we were taught to do is to tell our faith. That the goal was to get people to confess with their mouths that Jesus Christ is Lord. To pray that prayer. And all of that is good and wonderful and necessary. And we shouldn't let go of that. Not for a moment. But what Jesus spent his ministry doing was not just telling, but showing and telling. And I wonder if maybe part of the challenge that has faced the church in this moment in which increasingly younger people in our in our country, larger and larger numbers of people are beginning to feel, or not beginning to feel, already feel a sense of disconnect from the church, is that maybe we're a little better at telling than we are at showing. Another one of the most significant findings in the study, the Barna study, is that the primary view that outsiders have of Christians is that the main thing that we're interested in is making them like us, either by trying to get them to convert to our faith, or, their words, not mine, through forcing people to adhere to our values by voting in candidates who will uphold those values legally. Now, I'm not saying that that is true or fair. Although I will tell you, in my experience with pastors and Christian leaders, I can tell you that at least sometimes it is. But regardless of whether it's true or fair, it is still the perception that a growing number of people in our country have about Christianity and about the church. And if we are going to help connect people to God and Jesus Christ, that is a perception that we absolutely must deal with. But the amazing thing about those statistics is that when Christians shift from merely telling to something broader than that, attitudes almost overnight go through this radical change. The statistics say that when Christians begin not by asking people to believe, but their first way of sharing who they are with people is serving and meeting the needs of others, then the unchristian world, the non-Christian world, responds in overwhelmingly positive ways. That's why the lowest favorability rating and the highest favorability rating in Barna's research in history, one goes to a televangelist and the other one goes, the low end to a televangelist and the high end to Mother Teresa. I was reading a story a couple of weeks ago about a man named Tom Sine, who was one of the most creative and impactful missionaries in the United States in recent history. He spent almost all of his time in ministering in some of the largest inner cities in our country. He was sent, he's an older gentleman, and so he's been doing this for decades, and he was interviewed not too long ago to talk about the shift in his own practice of how he goes about doing what he does as a missionary. He said, when I was first commissioned in my 20s, I did what I was taught to do, which is to go and to talk about sin and grace. To talk about how people needed Jesus in their lives, about how people needed God, and the only way to get to God was through Jesus. What separated us from God was sin. And I preached that gospel place after place, and I have to tell you, the early days of my ministry, it wasn't particularly successful, at least in terms of actually leading people to connect with God and Jesus Christ through the church. After a few years, I began to realize, quote, I was merely addressing the spiritual consequences of sin. I was addressing the problems of the middle class from which I emerged, which were primarily psychological and emotional needs. And while I don't discount those needs, they are actual needs. After a while, I realized that in the inner city, I needed a, quote, thicker gospel. The women I was speaking to needed Jesus Christ to help them stay out of prostitution, but they also needed an alternative income. The men who were struggling with drugs, either using them or selling them, they needed Jesus, but they also needed a job. The unemployed workers that I talked to needed Jesus Christ, but they also needed a way to feed their children. What I needed to learn to preach was the whole gospel for their whole lives. Another thing that churches are discovering, not just missionaries, is that for a long time, the front door to the church was worship. Stop and think about that for a second. If you say you want to invite someone to church, is what you think about is bringing someone into this room at this hour. You want to invite someone to church. And in a day and a time when the church was at the center of culture, when people had a background, a framework for for understanding what it is that we do around here. That makes complete and total sense. But in a world where fewer and fewer people have that background, inviting them to come and sing the songs that we sing or get up and listen to someone like me is almost like asking them to listen to a foreign language. So some of the churches that are kind of on the cutting edge missiologically in our country have started to discover that the front door for the church increasingly is not worship services, no matter what style that worship service might be. Instead, the front door for the church isn't actually attached to the church building at all. It's out in the world. That when we as Christians live out our faith and make a difference in the lives of hurting people, of needy people, that is one of the absolute best and frankly easiest ways to enter into faith conversations with people. Stop and think about it for a second. As of right now, we have either 38 or 39, I didn't check the numbers when I came in this morning, 38 or 39 people who have agreed to serve as tutors for those kindergartners at Alderman Elementary School. Now, I don't know, I haven't looked at all the names of those 38 people, but just say, for the sake of argument, you're one of those 38 or 39 people. And your neighbor down the street that's never ever darkened the door of a church finds out that you're going once a week to go and invest your life in the life of an inner city kindergartner. Why are you doing that? What is it that would make you go and help those kids? Well, you've got a really great answer, don't you? I think that's what Jesus wants me to do. The most hardened skeptic or the most out there believer of another faith, I've never met a person that would say it's a bad idea to go and tutor a kindergartner. Have you? And yet that almost instantly gives you an opportunity not only to be the presence of Christ to that kindergartner, but to everybody who knows that story about what you're invested in your life. And that will not just be true for what we do at Alderman Elementary School. That will be true for helping feed people, helping welcome refugees, helping find shelter for homeless people, helping welcome people that have experienced the challenges, the difficulties of incarceration. From my own experience, I would say to you that the best and most deep and meaningful conversations I have about Jesus with non-Christians almost always begin in a place of serving others. And don't be surprised. Don't be shocked. In fact, be prepared for it when somebody says, "Hey, can I come and help? Can I come be a part of making a difference in the life of a child or somebody who just got out of prison or somebody that's brand new to our country?" And you can give them that opportunity and be connecting them to Jesus the whole time. That is why we're doing what we're doing this year-long mission trip. Not only to meet the needs of the people that we'll come into contact with. That's important. That stands on its own 2 feet. But also because it enriches our witness. One big challenge that I want to put in front of every single person in our church is this: for everybody to ask the question, which of those 5 areas can I invest a portion of my time? Have you made that commitment yet? Have you decided which one of those 5 places that you can go deep and make a commitment? Because I think if you will, you'll discover God is going to open so many doors that go far beyond even the hour or 2 that you might spend doing what it is that you've committed to do. And that He'll bless and enrich your life along the way as well. What would it look like if our whole church took the whole gospel to our whole community? I think we've discovered that all of us might be might be made whole. Let's not be a church that just does this. Let's be a church that gives feet and hands to the gospel. Would you pray with me? Father, help us to go where we are needed, to love who needs loving, for their benefit, for ours, so that together we might experience how high and how deep and how wide is your great love for us. It's in Jesus' name I pray.